The desert wind howled through the barren landscape of Arizona territory, carrying with it the sting of sand and the promise of another merciless day. The year was 1880, and the sun bore down upon the earth with the intensity of a blacksmith's forge, baking the red clay until it cracked like broken promises. Saguaro cacti stood as silent sentinels against the bleached sky, their arms raised in eternal surrender to the harsh elements that ruled this unforgiving land. Clara Whitman pulled her weathered shawl tighter around her shoulders as she stood in the doorway of her ramshackle wooden cabin. The structure leaned precariously to one side, its boards warped by years of exposure to the desert's extremes. She was 27 years old, though the harshness of her life had etched lines around her eyes that belonged to a woman twice her age. Her auburn hair, once lustrous, now hung limp beneath her bonnet, dulled by dust and sorrow. 2 years had passed since Thomas died, leaving her alone in this desolate place. The consumption had taken him slowly, cruelly, over the course of a winter that seemed to stretch on forever. She had nursed him through the final months, watching helplessly as he coughed blood into handkerchiefs that she could never quite wash clean. When spring finally came, it brought not renewal but an empty grave behind the cabin and a silence that pressed against her ears like cotton. The morning routine was always the same. Clara rose before dawn to tend to her meager garden, coaxing life from soil that seemed determined to remain barren. She had learned which plants could survive here, the hardy desert marigolds, the stubborn prickly pears, and the precious herbs that she dried and bundled to sell in town. It was these herbs that kept her from starvation, though barely. As she worked, her hands moving mechanically through the familiar tasks, Clara couldn't help but think of the other burden she carried, one that weighed heavier than widowhood in the eyes of the townspeople. 5 years of marriage to Thomas had produced no children. The midwife in Perdition, the nearest town, had examined her once and shaken her head grimly. "Some women just ain't built for it," she'd said, not unkindly, but with the finality of a judge passing sentence. The sun climbed higher, and Clara knew she could delay no longer. Today was market day, and she needed supplies. Flour, salt, perhaps a bit of sugar if her herbs sold well. She loaded her small cart with a carefully bundled sage, chamomile, and desert lavender, checking each package twice to ensure they were properly dried. Every penny mattered out here. The journey to Perdition took 2 hours by foot, pulling the cart along the rutted trail that passed for a road. Clara kept her head down, focusing on the rhythm of her steps rather than the vastness of the empty landscape that surrounded her. Occasionally, she passed the bleached bones of cattle or horses that had succumbed to the desert's embrace, grim reminders of how quickly this land could claim the unprepared. Perdition sprawled across a flat expanse of dust and disappointment, its wooden buildings huddled together as if seeking comfort from the wilderness that pressed in on all sides. The town had sprung up around a now depleted silver mine, and though the easy wealth had long since dried up, the people remained, too stubborn or too poor to seek their fortunes elsewhere. Clara made her way to the general store, where Mrs. Hutchinson presided over her domain of dry goods and gossip with equal fervor. The woman's small eyes tracked Clara's approach, and she could already see the familiar expression of pity mixed with disdain settling across the shopkeeper's fleshy features. "Morning, Mrs. Whitman." "Mrs." Hutchinson said, her tone suggesting that there was nothing good about it. "Got your herbs, I see." "Yes, ma'am." Clara began unpacking her bundles, arranging them neatly on the corner of the counter designated for trade goods. She kept her eyes focused on her task, but she could feel the weight of stares from the other women in the store. "Such a shame," she heard Mrs. Patterson whisper to her companion, not quite softly enough. "Young widow, all alone out there, and with her condition, barren as that desert she lives in," came the reply. "What man would want her now? Damaged goods, twice over." Clara's hands trembled slightly as she finished arranging her herbs, but she kept her face carefully neutral. She had learned that showing pain only encouraged them, like coyotes sensing weakness in their prey. "I'll take the usual in trade," Clara said quietly. "Flour, salt, a tin of lard, Mrs. Hutchinson made a show of examining the herbs, though they both knew she would accept them. There were few enough sources of medicinal plants in these parts, and Clara's were always properly prepared. Heard tell there's been trouble on the mountain roads. Mrs. Hutchinson said as she measured out flour. Band of outlaws hit a stage last week, killed the driver, and made off with the strongbox. You best be careful, living out there alone. Course, I suppose you don't have much worth stealing. The words stung, but Clara merely nodded. I'll be cautious. As she loaded her supplies, Clara caught a glimpse of herself in the store's small mirror. The woman looking back at her seemed a stranger, hollow-cheeked, eyes dull with resignation. When had she become this ghost of herself? The walk home seemed longer, the cart heavier despite its lighter load. The rumors of outlaws added another layer of worry to her already burdened mind. The Law and Perdition consisted of Sheriff Briggs, a man more interested in the bottle than in keeping peace, and his deputy, who was little more than a boy playing at being a lawman. If trouble came to her door, Clara knew she would face it alone. As afternoon gave way to evening, Clara sat on the rough bench outside her cabin, watching the sun paint the desert in shades of fire. The beauty of it still had the power to catch her breath. Even after all these years, the sky blazed orange and crimson. The mountains in the distance turned purple as shadows, and for a moment, the harshness of the land was transformed into something almost magical. But as darkness crept across the landscape, so too did the familiar despair creep back into her heart. She thought of the women in town, their whispered words and pointed looks. Worthless. That's what she was in their eyes. A woman who couldn't bear children, who couldn't keep a husband alive, who scraped by selling weeds to survive. Clara wrapped her arms around herself, though the evening was still warm. Sometimes she wondered if they were right. What value did she have in this world that measured a woman's worth by her ability to produce sons for the frontier? Thomas had never made her feel less for her barrenness. But Thomas was gone, and with him had gone the last person who had seen her as more than her failings. A coyote called in the distance, its mournful cry echoing across the empty miles. Clara stood and went inside, barring the door against the night and all its dangers. She lit her single candle, its weak flame pushing back the darkness just enough to remind her how vast it truly was. As she prepared her simple meal of cornbread and beans, Clara tried not to think about tomorrow, or the next day, or all the days stretching ahead of her like the endless desert outside her door. She tried not to think about the outlaws in the mountains, or the contempt in the town. She tried not to think about anything at all, but in the silence of her cabin, with only the wind for company, the thoughts came anyway. They always did, and as she lay down on her narrow cot, pulling the thin blanket up to her chin, Clara Whitman wondered if she would ever again feel like anything more than a ghost haunting her own life. The candle flickered and died, plunging the cabin into darkness. Outside, the desert night came alive with the sounds of creatures adapted to its harsh embrace. The rustle of snakes, the scurry of kangaroo rats, the distant howl of wolves. They all had their place in this unforgiving ecosystem. Clara wondered, as sleep finally claimed her, if she would ever find hers. The morning sun had barely crested the eastern mountains when Clara set out for the creek, her wooden bucket swinging rhythmically at her sides. The path to water was a treacherous mile through rocky terrain and thorny mesquite. But she had made this journey countless times since Thomas's death. Water was life in the desert, and the small creek that wound through the canyon was her lifeline. She was halfway there when she saw him. The man stood beside the creek, his back to her, filling what appeared to be several large canteens. He was tall, taller than any man she'd seen in Perdition, with broad shoulders that strained against his buckskin shirt. His dark hair hung past his collar, and even from a distance, she could see the wear on his clothes that spoke of hard living in wild places. Clara froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. A stranger by the water source could mean trouble. She began to back away slowly, but her foot found a loose stone that clattered down the canyon wall. The man spun around with the fluid grace of a mountain cat, his hand moving instinctively toward the rifle propped against a nearby boulder. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other across the morning shadows. The stranger's face was weathered but not old, perhaps 35 years, with deep-set eyes the color of storm clouds and a jaw darkened by several days' worth of stubble. A thin scar ran from his left temple to his cheekbone, pale against his sun-darkened skin. "Ma'am," he said finally, his voice low and rough as sandstone. He moved his hand away from the rifle, holding both palms out in a gesture of peace. "Didn't mean to startle you." Clara found her voice, though it came out steadier than she felt. "This is my water source. I wasn't expecting to find anyone here." "Your water source?" A ghost of a smile played at the corner of his mouth. "Last I checked, the desert didn't much care for property claims, but I'll be finished shortly." There was no mockery in his tone, just a gentle statement of fact. Clara felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. "I only meant I live nearby. I come here every few days." The man's gray eyes studied her with an intensity that made her acutely aware of her patched dress and work-roughened hands. "Alone?" The question sent a spike of fear through her, but something in his expression, concern rather than threat, made her answer honestly. "Yes." He shook his head slowly. "That's dangerous country for anyone alone, especially—" He trailed off, but Clara knew what he'd been about to say, "especially a woman." "I manage," she said, lifting her chin slightly. "I can see that." He capped his last canteen and stood, and Clara was struck again by his height and presence. He moved with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in wild places. "Name's Elias McKenna." "Clara Whitman," she replied, surprised to find herself offering her name so readily. Elias shouldered his canteens, then paused, looking at her empty buckets. "Those for water?" She nodded, without another word. He set down his gear and took the buckets from her hands. His fingers brushed hers briefly, and Clara was startled by how rough they were, and by the unexpected jolt that went through her at the contact. "You don't have to," she began, but he was already kneeling by the creek, filling the first bucket with careful efficiency. "My mama raised me proper," he said without looking up. "See a lady needing help, you help, simple as that." Clara watched, bemused, as this stranger, this mountain man who looked like he could wrestle a bear, carefully filled her water buckets. When he finished, he stood and lifted both easily, the muscles in his arms flexing beneath his shirt. "Lead the way, Mrs. Whitman." She wanted to protest, to insist she could manage alone as she always had, but something about his quiet certainty stopped her. Instead, she found herself walking back up the path with Elias McKenna at her side, matching his long stride to her shorter steps without complaint. "You're not from around here," she said, needing to fill the strange silence that had settled between them. "No, ma'am. I work the high country mostly. Hunting, trapping. Come down to trade every few months." He navigated a tricky portion of the trail with ease, never spilling a drop. "You said you live alone. Your husband—" "Dead. 2 years now. I'm sorry for your loss." The words were simple, conventional even, but something in the way he said them, with genuine understanding rather than pity, made her throat tighten unexpectedly. They walked in companionable silence after that, Clara stealing glances at this unusual man. Everything about him spoke of solitude and self-sufficiency, from his worn gear to the way he moved through the landscape as if he were part of it. Yet here he was, carrying water for a stranger. They were within sight of her cabin when the wind shifted, bringing with it a wall of dust and sand. Clara had lived in the desert long enough to recognize the signs. A sandstorm was coming, and fast. "Storm," Elias said unnecessarily, setting down the buckets and scanning the horizon where a brown wall of dust was building. "My cabin," Clara began, but he was already shaking his head. "Too far. We need shelter now." His eyes swept the landscape with practiced efficiency before landing on a cluster of rocks about 50 yards away. "There, come on." He grabbed her hand without ceremony and pulled her toward the rock formation. Clara barely had time to mourn her abandoned water before the storm hit with the force of a freight train. The world disappeared into a howling brown chaos that stung exposed skin and filled mouths and noses with grit. Elias pulled her into a small cavity in the rocks, positioning himself between her and the worst of the storm. His body sheltered hers as he wrapped his coat around them both, creating a small pocket of breathable air. Clara found herself pressed against his chest, her face buried in his shirt to escape the stinging sand. She could feel his heartbeat, steady and strong, and smell the mixture of leather, wood smoke, and something indefinably masculine that clung to him. It had been so long since she'd been this close to another person that the sensation was almost overwhelming. The storm raged for what felt like hours, but was probably less than one. When it finally began to abate, Clara became acutely aware of their position, of his arms around her, of the solid warmth of his body, of the way he'd instinctively protected her. She pulled back slightly, embarrassed by her reaction to his proximity. "Thank you," she said, her voice rough from the dust. He released her immediately, though he kept his coat draped around her shoulders. "You hurt?" She shook her head, then realized she was still clutching his shirt. She let go hastily, feeling heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the desert sun. They emerged from their shelter to find the landscape transformed. Dunes had shifted, creating new patterns in the sand. Clara's abandoned water buckets were nowhere to be seen. "I'm sorry about your water," Elias said. "It's just water. I can get more." She looked toward her cabin, still standing despite the storm's fury. Would you like to come in, get cleaned up? It's the least I can do after you helped me." He studied her for a long moment, and Clara found herself holding her breath. What was she doing, inviting a strange man into her home? But something about Elias McKenna made her feel safer than she had in 2 years. "If it's no trouble," he said finally. The cabin seemed even smaller with him in it. Elias had to duck to get through the doorway, and his presence filled the spare room in a way that made Clara nervously aware of every humble detail. The patched curtains, the meager furnishings, the narrow cot that served as her bed. She busied herself heating water on the stove, grateful for something to do with her hands. "It's not much," she said unnecessarily. "It's shelter in a hard land. That's everything." He was examining her collection of drying herbs with interest. "You know your plants. My grandmother taught me, back in Missouri, before," she trailed off. "Before Thomas, before the move west, before everything changed. These are quality, better than what they're selling in most towns." He turned to face her. "You trade these?" "In perdition. When I can—" Something flickered across his face, understanding, perhaps, of just how hard her life must be. But he said nothing, for which Clara was grateful. She'd had enough of pity. They shared a simple meal of beans and cornbread, Elias contributing some dried venison from his pack. The conversation flowed easier than Clara would have expected, touching on the challenges of desert life, the patterns of game in the mountains, the best times to harvest certain plants. "You know a lot about living off the land," Clara observed. "Been doing it since I was 15. My folks died in a cholera outbreak. Figured the mountains were safer than towns after that." He said it matter-of-factly, but Clara heard the old pain beneath the words. "I'm sorry," she said, meaning it. He shrugged. "Long time ago. We all got our sorrows." As evening approached, Elias rose to leave. "Thank you for the meal. Mrs. Whitman. Been a while since I sat at a proper table." "Clara," she said impulsively. "Just Clara." He smiled then, a real smile that transformed his harsh features. "Clara, I'll remember that." At the door, he paused. "I'll be camping up at Boulder Creek for a few days. Hunting. If you need anything, if there's trouble, you send up a smoke signal. I'll see it. I couldn't impose—" "It's not imposing. It's neighbors looking out for each other, even if the neighborhood is a mite spread out." After he left, Clara stood in her doorway watching his tall figure disappear into the gathering dusk. The cabin felt different somehow, emptier but also charged with possibility. She could still smell the faint scent of leather and wood smoke, could still feel the phantom warmth where his coat had wrapped around her. for the first time in 2 years. Clara Whitman went to bed not thinking about death or loss or the cruel whispers of townspeople. Instead, she thought about gray eyes and gentle strength, about a man who carried water for strangers and shared his coat in storms. She thought about Elias McKenna, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she smiled. The weeks that followed Elias's first visit passed with an unusual rhythm. Every few days, Clara would find evidence of his presence, fresh game left by her door, her woodpile mysteriously replenished, repairs made to loose boards on her cabin that she hadn't even realized needed fixing. He never announced himself, never demanded thanks or recognition. The gifts simply appeared like benevolent magic in the desert dawn. At first, Clara tried to catch him in the act, rising before sunrise to watch from her window. But Elias moved like smoke through the landscape, and she never saw more than a distant figure disappearing into the rocky terrain. Part of her was frustrated by his elusiveness, but another part, a part she didn't want to examine too closely, found something thrilling in this silent exchange of care. When she finally encountered him again, it was at the creek. This time, she was prepared. "Mr. McKenna," she called out as he knelt to fill his canteens. "I've been hoping to thank you properly." He looked up, that ghost of a smile playing at his lips. "Nothing to thank me for. Clara, a haunch of venison, firewood for a month, and a door that no longer squeaks would say otherwise." She set down her water buckets with deliberate firmness. "I don't take charity. Never said it was charity." He stood slowly, his gray eyes serious. "Man sees work that needs doing. He does it. Simple as that." "And what work do you see that needs doing here?" The question came out sharper than she intended. Defensive. Elias studied her for a long moment. "I see a woman making a hard life harder by thinking she has to do everything alone. Pride's a cold companion in winter. Clara?" The words stung because they were true. She looked away, blinking against the sudden moisture in her eyes. "The people in town already think, they already say things about me. If they knew a man was coming around." "What do they say?" Clara laughed bitterly. "That I'm worthless, a barren woman who couldn't keep her husband alive. Now they'll add loose woman to the list." She felt rather than saw him move closer. When she looked up, he was standing just a foot away, his expression dark with something that might have been anger, but not at her. "Anyone who'd call you worthless is a fool," he said quietly. "I've watched you, seen how you tend those plants like they're children, how you've kept that cabin standing through storms that would send most running for town, seen the strength it takes to walk into that nest of vipers every week to trade, knowing what they whisper." His voice roughened. "There's nothing worthless about you, Clara Whitman, nothing at all." The fierce conviction in his words broke something loose inside her. Before she could stop herself, tears were streaming down her face. Tears she'd held back for 2 years. Tears for Thomas, for her empty womb, for the lonely nights and cruel words and the endless struggle just to survive. Elias didn't try to comfort her with platitudes. He simply handed her his kerchief and waited while she cried herself empty. When the storm passed, leaving her feeling hollowed out but strangely cleaner, he spoke again. "My offer stands. You need help. You ask. That's what neighbors do." "Is that what we are?" Clara asked, wiping her eyes. "Neighbors?" Something shifted in his expression, a warmth that made her pulse quicken. "For now," he said simply. It was on her next trip to perdition that the whispers began in earnest. Clara had barely set foot in the general store when Mrs. Patterson's voice carried across the room. "Seen that mountain man around her place. Jenny did, several times now. Can you imagine? Her husband barely cold in the ground." 2 years is hardly barely cold," Clara said loudly, causing several heads to turn. She was tired of pretending not to hear. Mrs. Patterson's face flushed, but her eyes remained hard. "Well, I suppose some women have needs that override proper mourning. And some women have tongues that override proper manners." Clara shot back. A shocked silence fell over the store. "Mrs." Hutchinson cleared her throat nervously. Now, ladies, what exactly are you implying, Mrs. Patterson? Clara continued, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. That I should refuse help when offered? That I should let my cabin fall apart and starve rather than accept assistance from a kind man? Or is it simply that you can't imagine any man showing me kindness without expecting something improper in return? Mrs. Patterson's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. It was Mrs. Garrett, the banker's wife, who spoke up. It's about appearances. Mrs. Whitman. What will people think? I find I care less and less what people think, Clara replied. Especially people who measure a woman's worth by her womb and nothing else. She conducted her business in icy silence after that, aware of the scandalized whispers following her every move. But as she loaded her supplies, a small, unexpected voice spoke up. Good for you, said Mary Chen, the Chinese laundry owner's daughter, quietly enough that only Clara could hear. They talk about my family too. Say we don't belong, but we're still here. Clara squeezed the girl's hand briefly, finding comfort in this small moment of solidarity. The ride home felt longer than usual, the weight of the confrontation settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket. What had possessed her to speak out like that? She'd only made things worse, confirmed their suspicions that she was becoming wild, improper, lost in thought. She almost missed the movement in the rocks ahead, but some instinct made her pull up short, and that caution saved her life. 3 men emerged from behind the boulder formation, spreading out to block the trail. They were rough-looking, with the hard eyes and trail-worn appearance of men who lived outside the law. Clara's heart began to pound as she recognized the type drifters, outlaws, the kind who brought nothing but trouble. Well, well, said the one in front, a lean man with greasy blonde hair and a smile that made Clara's skin crawl. What have we here? Little lady all alone? Please, Clara said, hating how her voice shook. I don't have anything of value. Now, that's where you might be wrong, the man said, moving closer. His companions chuckled. An ugly sound. Pretty woman like you, all alone out here. Might be you have something we'd value highly. Clara's hand inched toward the old rifle Thomas had taught her to shoot. But the second man, heavy-set with a scarred face, shook his head. Wouldn't try that. Missy, 3 of us, 1 of you. Don't like them odds. The third man, younger than the others with nervous eyes, had circled behind her cart. Not much here. Jake, some flour, dried plants. The valuable stuff ain't in the cart, Jake said, his eyes never leaving Clara. Is it, sweetheart? Terror clawed at Clara's throat. She knew what they intended, could see it in their faces. The desert stretched empty in all directions. No one would hear her scream. That's when she heard it. The distinctive whistle of an arrow, followed by a meaty thud. The heavy-set man cried out, clutching his shoulder where an arrow protruded, before the others could react. Elias emerged from the rocks above them like an avenging spirit, his rifle trained on Jake's chest. The lady said she doesn't have anything for you, Elias said, his voice deadly calm. I suggest you believe her. Jake's hand hovered near his gun. This ain't your business, mountain man. So, made it my business when you threatened her. Elias's rifle never wavered. Your friend needs doctoring. Take him and go, now. There's 3 of us, the younger one started, but Elias cut him off. We're 3 of you, now 1's bleeding, and if you don't move in the next 10 seconds, there'll be 2 bleeding, or worse. His gray eyes were cold as winter steel. Your choice. Something in his stance, his absolute confidence, must have convinced them. Jake spat in the dust but nodded to his companions. They helped the wounded man onto his horse, Jake turning back for one last threat. This ain't over, mountain man. You just made some powerful enemies. Wouldn't be the first time, Elias replied evenly. Won't be the last. Get moving. They watched until the outlaws disappeared over a ridge. Only then did Clara realize she was shaking. Her legs gave out, and she would have fallen if Elias hadn't caught her, his strong arm steadying her against his chest. It's all right, he murmured against her hair. You're safe now. I've got you." Clara clung to him, breathing in his familiar scent, letting his solid presence chase away the terror. When she finally pulled back, she saw something in his eyes that took her breath away, a fierce protectiveness mixed with another emotion she didn't dare name. "How did you know?" she whispered. "Saw them from the ridge, moving to cut off the trail. Been tracking them for days. They've been working their way along the settlements, looking for easy prey." His jaw tightened. "They won't bother you again." "How can you be sure?" "Because I'll make sure of it." He helped her back onto the cart, then surprised her by climbing up beside her. "I'm seeing you home. No arguments." Clara didn't argue. She was too shaken, too grateful for his presence. As they rode, she found herself studying his profile, the strong jaw, the watchful eyes, the hands that could draw a bow or fix a door with equal skill. "The town already talks about us," she said quietly. "This will make it worse." Elias was quiet for a long moment. "Do you care what they say?" Clara thought about Mrs. Patterson's cruel words, about years of whispers and judgment. Then she thought about this man who asked nothing of her, who protected and provided without demanding gratitude or anything else. "No," she said finally. "I don't care anymore?" He glanced at her, and she saw approval in his eyes. "Good. Let them talk. Their words can't hurt you unless you let them." When they reached her cabin, Elias insisted on checking the perimeter, making sure no one had been there. Satisfied, he began to leave, but Clara caught his arm. "Stay for supper," she said. "Please, I don't want to be alone just yet." He studied her face, then nodded. "All right." As Clara prepared the meal with hands that still trembled slightly, she was aware of Elias's presence in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with a warmth spreading through her chest. He had saved her today, but more than that, he had stood as a buffer between her and a world that seemed determined to break her. "Thank you," she said as they sat down to eat. "For today, for everything." "Don't thank me for doing what's right," he replied. "Besides, I have my own reasons." "What reasons?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. Elias looked at her across the table, his gray eyes warm in the lamplight. "Maybe I'm tired of being alone too," he said simply. The words hung in the air between them, weighted with possibility. Clara felt something shift in her chest, a door opening that she'd thought was sealed forever. It terrified her. It thrilled her. It made her feel alive in a way she'd forgotten was possible. As night fell over the desert, they sat together in comfortable silence, two souls finding solace in each other's company against a world that seemed determined to break them, and for the first time since Thomas died. Clara didn't dread the coming darkness. She had a protector now, a friend, and maybe, just maybe, something more. The invitation came on a crisp morning 3 days after the incident with the outlaws. Clara was tending her herbs when she heard the familiar whistle, a meadowlark's call that she'd learned was Elias's way of announcing himself without startling her. She looked up to find him standing at the edge of her garden, a pair of rabbits hanging from his belt. "Morning," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Good morning." She straightened, brushing dirt from her hands, trying to ignore the way her pulse quickened at the sight of him. "Those for trading?" "For eating, if you'll join me." He shifted his weight, and Clara realized with surprise that he seemed almost nervous. "Thought you might like to see the high country. My camp's a day's ride up the mountain. Different world up there, pine forests, cold streams, air so clean it hurts to breathe." Clara's first instinct was to refuse, a woman traveling alone with a man to his remote camp. The townspeople would have a field day. But then she thought of their cruel whispers, their judgment that followed her everywhere, and felt a surge of defiance. "When?" she asked. A smile broke across his face, transforming his usually serious features. "Tomorrow, if you're willing. Need to check my trap lines anyway, and, well, I'd appreciate the company." That night, Clara barely slept. She packed and repacked her small traveling bag, second-guessing her decision a dozen times. What was she doing? Yet when dawn broke and she heard Elias's whistle, she was dressed and ready, her heart hammering with equal parts fear and excitement. He'd brought an extra horse, a gentle mare that nuzzled Clara's hand when introduced. "Her name's Sage," Elias said, helping Clara mount. "Steady as they come." The journey began in familiar territory, winding through the desert canyons Clara knew well. But as they climbed higher, the landscape began to change. Scrub brush gave way to juniper, then piñón pine. The air grew cooler, carrying scents she'd almost forgotten: pine resin, damp earth, the green smell of growing things that didn't have to fight for every drop of moisture. They stopped at midday by a stream that tumbled down from the heights, its water so clear Clara could see every pebble on the bottom. She knelt and cupped the cold water to her lips, gasping at its purity after years of alkaline desert wells. "Different from what you're used to," Elias observed, watching her wonder. "Like a different world entirely." She looked around at the towering pines, the ferns growing in the shade, the moss-covered rocks. "I'd forgotten places like this existed." They continued climbing, the horses picking their way along trails Clara could barely see, but which Elias navigated with easy familiarity. He pointed out things as they went: the scratch marks where a bear had marked its territory, the delicate print of deer in soft earth, an eagle's nest high in a dead pine. "You really know this country?" Clara said. "Been walking these mountains for near 20 years. They're more home than any town ever was." He glanced at her. "Most folks find it too lonely up here. And you? Never found the right reason to come down." He said it simply, but Clara heard layers of meaning in the words. By late afternoon, they reached his camp. Clara had expected something rough, barely more than a lean-to. Instead, she found a well-constructed cabin nestled against a cliff face, with a stone chimney and a covered porch that looked out over a vista that stole her breath. The valley spread below them like a painted canvas, the desert a distant golden shimmer beyond green forests. "Elias," she breathed, "it's beautiful. Gets cold in winter," he said, but she could hear the pleasure in his voice at her reaction. "Snow gets deep enough to bury the porch, but spring and summer." He trailed off, letting the view speak for itself. He showed her around with a shy pride: the smokehouse where he cured meat, the spring that provided fresh water year-round, the small corral where he kept his horses when not ranging far. Everything was neat, well-maintained, built to last. "You did all this yourself?" "Had nothing but time." He started building a fire in the outdoor pit. "First years after my folks died, I just wandered. Took a while to realize I was looking for a place to stop running." As evening fell, they sat by the fire eating fresh trout Elias had caught from a nearby stream. The silence between them was comfortable now, filled with the crackle of flames and the distant call of a wolf pack. "Doesn't it get lonely?" Clara asked eventually. "All this beauty, no one to share it with?" Elias poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the darkening sky. "Used to tell myself it didn't, that the mountains were company enough." He looked at her across the flames. "Been realizing lately, I might have been lying to myself." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire. "Elias, I know what I am. Clara, a man who spent more years with wolves than people, who barely remembers how to talk to folks, much less—" He stopped, jaw working. "Just saying, I understand lonely, and I recognize it in others." The raw honesty in his voice made Clara's chest tight. "Is that what you see in me? Loneliness?" "I see strength," he said quietly. "I see grace under hardship. I see a woman who's been told she's worthless so many times she's started to believe it, even though everything about her proves otherwise." He met her eyes, and yes, I see lonely, same as what I see in the mirror. Clara stood abruptly, overwhelmed by the intensity of his words and her reaction to them. She walked to the edge of the firelight, wrapping her arms around herself. The stars were beginning to emerge, more than she'd ever seen from the desert floor. She heard him rise, felt him approach, but he stopped a respectful distance away. "I'm sorry if I spoke out of turn." "You didn't." She turned to face him, surprised to find her eyes wet with tears. "No one's ever... Thomas loved me, but he never saw me the way you just described. Never looked past what I couldn't give him to see what I could." "Then he was a fool too," Elias said roughly. "Any man who had you and wanted more is a fool." The words hung between them, charged with meaning. Clara took a step closer, drawn by something stronger than propriety or fear. "What do you want, Elias?" He was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Things I've got no right to want, not from a lady like you." "I'm no lady," Clara said. "I'm a barren widow living alone in the desert. The town thinks I'm worthless. Maybe they're right." She didn't see him move, but suddenly his hands were on her shoulders, his gray eyes blazing in the firelight. "Don't," he said fiercely. "Don't you ever say that. Not here. Not with me." They stood frozen, his hands warm through the fabric of her dress, their faces inches apart. Clara could feel the tension in him, the careful control. She knew she should step back, knew this was the moment to return to safer ground. Instead, she reached up and placed her hand against his cheek, feeling the rasp of stubble against her palm. "Clara," he breathed, and her name on his lips was prayer and warning both. A wolf howled in the distance, breaking the spell. Elias stepped back, his hands falling to his sides. "You should get some rest. Long day tomorrow." He showed her to the cabin, insisting she take his bed while he slept outside by the fire. Clara lay in the narrow cot that smelled of pine and leather and him, listening to the night sounds of the mountain, feeling more alive than she had in years. The next days passed in a blur of wonder. Elias showed her his world, teaching her to read animal signs, to find edible plants she'd never seen in the desert, to move quietly through the forest. He was a patient teacher, never condescending, always ready with a steadying hand when the terrain grew treacherous. They visited his trap lines, Clara learning the skill and humanity with which he worked, taking only what he needed, ensuring quick, clean deaths, always leaving enough animals to sustain the population. She watched him work, noting the sure movements of his hands, the respect he showed even to his prey. In the evenings, they talked by the fire. Elias told her about his youth in Tennessee, the farm his parents had worked before cholera took them. Clara shared memories of Missouri, of the grandmother who'd taught her herb lore, of dreams she'd once had before life narrowed to mere survival. "What did you want to be?" Elias asked one night. Before I learned what I couldn't be." Clara stared into the flames. "I wanted to be a teacher. Thought I'd have a schoolhouse full of children during the day, my own children at night." She laughed bitterly. "The universe has a sense of humor. Maybe you're meant to teach in other ways," Elias suggested. "Those herbs you grow and prepare, that's knowledge worth passing on. Healing's just as important as reading and writing." It was a perspective she'd never considered, and it lodged in her chest like a warm coal. On their last night in the mountains, a storm rolled in. They took shelter in the cabin, rain drumming on the roof, wind howling through the pines. Clara sat at the small table while Elias tended the fire, aware of how the cabin seemed to shrink with both of them in it. "Thank you," she said suddenly, "for showing me this, for..." She gestured helplessly. "For seeing me as more than what I lack." Elias turned from the fire, his expression intense. "You don't lack anything. Clara, you're complete, whole, perfect as you are." The words broke something in her. She stood, crossing to him before she could lose her nerve. "I'm not perfect. I'm scared and lonely, and sometimes I wake up wondering why I bother to keep going." She took a shaky breath. "But these past days, with you, I remembered what it feels like to be alive." He caught her hands in his. "Clara, I know," she interrupted. "I know all the reasons this is foolish. I know what the town will say. I know you've built a life up here alone, and I have no right to complicate it." She looked up at him, letting him see everything in her eyes. "But I also know I haven't felt this way since..." No, I've never felt this way. Like I could be myself, wholly and completely, without apology. The storm outside seemed to pause, the world holding its breath. Then Elias pulled her against him, one hand tangling in her hair, the other pressing her close. "You think you're the only one feeling torn apart," he said roughly. "Think I haven't been going half mad wanting things I shouldn't?" Clara's heart was hammering so hard she was sure he could feel it. "What's stopping you?" "Honor, decency, the knowledge that you deserve better than a half-wild mountain man who's forgotten how to be with people." His thumb traced her cheekbone with incredible gentleness. "You deserve courting and pretty words and promises I don't know how to make." "I don't want pretty words," Clara whispered. "I want truth. I want someone who sees me. I want you." He made a sound that might have been her name, might have been surrender. Then his mouth found hers, and the storm outside was nothing compared to what erupted between them. The kiss was desperate, hungry. Years of loneliness and longing poured into the connection. Clara clung to him, feeling the careful control he maintained even in passion, the way he held her like she was precious and breakable and infinitely desired all at once. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Elias rested his forehead against hers. "This changes everything," he said. "I know," Clara replied, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, the thought of change didn't terrify her. It felt like coming home. The return to the desert felt like descending from heaven into purgatory. As Clara's cabin came into view, she was struck by how small and desolate it looked after the grandeur of the mountains. But Elias was beside her, his presence a shield against the returning weight of her old life. "I'll stay close for a few days," he said as they dismounted. "Make sure those outlaws have moved on." Clara wanted to tell him to stay forever, but the words stuck in her throat. Their kiss in the storm had changed everything. Yet neither had spoken of it during the journey down. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, but it was heavy with unspoken questions. It was 3 days before she had to face the town again. 3 days of Elias nearby, but carefully maintaining distance, as if they were both trying to figure out how to navigate this new territory between them. On the 4th morning, Clara loaded her cart with herbs and set out for perdition, her stomach churning with dread. She knew something was wrong the moment she entered the general store. The usual whispers were louder, more pointed, and misses. Patterson stood at the counter like a general ready for battle. "Well, well," the woman said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "The wilderness woman returns. Have a nice trip to the mountains, Mrs. Whitman." Clara kept her voice level. "I don't know what you mean." "Oh, I think you do. Mrs." Patterson's eyes glittered with malicious triumph. "Jenny's boy saw you riding off with that mountain man, gone for days, just the two of you, and here we all thought you were just a grieving widow." "What I do is none of your concern," Clara said, but she could feel heat rising in her face. "It is when you flaunt your impropriety in front of the whole town." "Mrs." Garrett chimed in. "What kind of example does that set for our daughters?" "An example of a woman making her own choices?" Clara shot back. The store erupted in shocked gasps. "Mrs." Hutchinson looked like she might faint, but it was Mrs. Patterson who delivered the killing blow. "A barren woman taking up with a wild man," she said with poisonous sweetness. "I suppose when you can't fulfill a woman's proper purpose, you might as well abandon all propriety, though what he sees in you is anyone's guess. Probably just convenient. A woman so desperate she'll accept any attention." The words hit Clara like physical blows. She felt her hands shake as she set down her herbs, her vision blurring. All her defiance crumbled under the weight of their judgment, their cruel summation of her worth. "That's enough." The voice came from behind Clara Mary Chen, the laundry owner's daughter, stepping forward with quiet dignity. "Mrs. Whitman has done nothing but survive in a hard land. If that offends you, perhaps the problem is with you, not her." "How dare you, Mrs. Patterson began, but Mary continued. "My family knows about judgment, about being called worthless. But we also know that worth isn't decided by bitter women with nothing better to do than tear others down. The stunned silence that followed was broken by Clara fleeing the store, her herbs abandoned on the counter. She made it to her cart before the tears came, great gulping sobs that shook her whole body. The cruelty she could handle, she'd grown accustomed to that, but to have it laid out so baldly, her deepest shames used as weapons. She was still crying when Elias found her on the trail home. He took one look at her face and dismounted, pulling her down from the cart and into his arms without a word. Clara sobbed against his chest, clinging to him as if he were the only solid thing in a world turned liquid. When the storm passed, she told him everything. The confrontation, Mrs. Patterson's words, the way they'd reduced her to nothing. Elias listened in stone-faced silence, his jaw working. "They're wrong," he said when she finished. "Are they?" Clara pulled back, wiping her eyes. "I am Barren. I am taking up with you. I am desperate for affection." "Stop." His hands framed her face, forcing her to meet his eyes. "You're the strongest woman I've ever known. You've survived losses that would break most people. You've carved out a life in a place that kills the weak, and you've done it with grace and dignity, no matter what those harpies say. But," and as for being desperate, his thumb brushed away a remaining tear, "if anyone's desperate here, it's me. Desperate to be near you, to hear your voice, to see you smile. You think I showed you the mountains out of pity? I showed you because I wanted to share the only beautiful thing in my life with the only person who's ever made me want to share anything." His words broke through her pain like sunlight through storm clouds. "Elias, I'm not good with words, Clara, but I know this. You could have any man you wanted. The fact that you might want me, that's not desperation. That's a gift I don't deserve." She kissed him then, pouring all her gratitude and growing love into the contact. When they broke apart, she felt steadier, stronger. "Come back to the cabin," she said. "Stay with me tonight. I don't care what they say anymore." He searched her face. "You sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything." That evening, as they sat together by her small fire, Clara felt a peace she hadn't known in years. Elias had cooked dinner, a simple stew that tasted like ambrosia after the emotional turmoil of the day. They talked quietly about inconsequential things, both aware of the growing tension between them but content to let it build. It was full dark when Elias stood to leave. "I should go." "No." Clara caught his hand. "Please, stay." He turned back, his gray eyes dark with desire and concern in equal measure. "Clara, if I stay, I know." She stood, moving close to him. "I'm not a child. Elias, I know what I'm asking. Do you?" His hand came up to cup her cheek. "Because if I stay tonight, I won't want to leave tomorrow. Or ever." "Then don't," she whispered. He studied her face for a long moment, then pulled her against him, his mouth claiming hers with a passion that stole her breath. This kiss was different from the one in the storm, deeper, more certain, full of promise and heat. Clara responded with equal fervor. Years of loneliness and longing poured into the connection. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Elias rested his forehead against hers. "You sure this is what you want, not just because of what those women said?" "This has nothing to do with them," Clara said firmly. "This is about us, about what I feel when I'm with you, about choosing to live instead of just survive." He made a sound deep in his throat and kissed her again, lifting her easily in his arms. Clara wrapped her arms around his neck, marveling at his strength, at the safety she felt in his embrace. The night that followed was a revelation. Elias's touch was reverent, worshipful, as if she were something precious and sacred. He mapped every inch of her with hands and lips, murmuring words of praise that healed wounds she hadn't even realized were still bleeding. Clara gave herself over to the sensation, to the joy of being desired, of being seen as whole and perfect despite everything. When passion finally overtook patience, they came together with a desperation born of loneliness and recognition. Two damaged souls finding solace in each other. creating something beautiful from their broken pieces. The desert wind howled outside, but inside the small cabin, there was only warmth and connection and the sound of whispered endearments. Afterward, they lay entwined. Clara's head on Elias's chest, listening to his heartbeat. His fingers combed through her hair, the gesture infinitely tender. "No regrets?" he asked quietly. "None," Clara said firmly. "For the first time in my life, I did something purely for myself, because I wanted it, because I wanted you." His arms tightened around her. "You have me, for as long as you'll let me stay." "Forever, then," she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "Forever," he agreed. They talked through the night, making plans and dreams. Elias would split his time between the mountains and the desert. They would expand the herb garden, maybe build a larger cabin. They would face the town's judgment together, drawing strength from each other. "They'll be brutal," Clara warned. "It'll be worse now." "Let them talk," Elias said. "Their words only have the power we give them, and I give them none." As dawn broke over the desert, painting the landscape in shades of gold and rose, Clara felt something she hadn't experienced in years: hope. Real, tangible hope for a future that held more than mere survival. She turned in Elias's arms, studying his face in the early light. He was awake, watching her with those storm-gray eyes that saw straight through to her soul. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "That I spent 20 years in those mountains thinking I was living," he said. "But I was just hiding. Took a desert flower to show me what living really means." "I'm no flower," Clara said. "I'm a cactus, prickly and tough and not much to look at. Cactus blooms are the most beautiful," Elias countered. "Because they're rare, because they survive where nothing else can, because when they finally open, it's like a miracle." His words made her throat tight with emotion. "You make me want to bloom," she whispered. "Then bloom," he said simply. "I'll be here to watch." As the sun rose fully, flooding the cabin with light, Clara kissed him again, slow and sweet and full of promise. Outside, she could hear the desert awakening, the call of quail, the rustle of lizards, the whisper of wind through sage. It was a hard land, an unforgiving land, but it was her land, and now, finally, she had someone to share it with. Someone who saw her not as a barren woman or a grieving widow, but as herself, whole and worthy and deserving of love. The town would talk. They would judge and condemn and whisper their poison. But here, in this moment, in the arms of a man who looked at her like she hung the stars, Clara Whitman finally understood her own worth. She was not worthless. She was not broken. She was a survivor, a bloomer in the desert, a woman who had chosen love over fear. And that was worth more than all the approval in the world. The peace of their newfound happiness lasted exactly 5 days. On the 6th morning, Clara woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of horses. Too many horses for anything good. She reached for Elias, but his side of the bed was empty, though still warm. Through the window, she could see him standing in the doorway, rifle in hand, facing a group of riders. Her blood chilled when she recognized the lead rider, Jake, the outlaw from the trail, his arm in a sling but his eyes burning with malice. Behind him were at least 8 men, all armed, all wearing the hard expressions of those who lived by violence. "Morning, mountain man," Jake called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Told you this wasn't over." Clara dressed quickly, her hands shaking as she loaded Thomas's old pistol. Through the thin walls, she could hear Elias's calm response. "Turn around and ride out. This doesn't have to end badly." Jake laughed, an ugly sound. "Oh, but it does. See, you cost me face in front of my boys. Made me look weak." "Sss, can't have that in my line of work." He gestured to the cabin. "Plus, I'm thinking you've gotten too comfortable playing house. Time to remind folks that this territory belongs to those strong enough to take it. Only thing you're strong enough to take is a bullet," Elias said evenly. "Last warning. The morning exploded into chaos. Jake went for his gun, but Elias was faster, his rifle cracking once. Jake toppled from his horse, clutching his shoulder, but his men were already scattering, firing as they moved. Clara burst through the door, pistol raised, and caught one outlaw by surprise. Her shot went wide but forced him to dive for cover. Elias grabbed her, pulling her behind the water trough as bullets splintered the cabin walls. "Get to the root cellar," he ordered, returning fire with deadly accuracy. "Not leaving you, Clara." His protest was cut short as more riders appeared on the horizon, but these wore badges, Sheriff Briggs and a hastily assembled posse from town. Clara's heart leaped, then sank as she realized the truth. The sheriff wasn't here to help. He was here to watch. The outlaws, caught between Elias's accurate fire and the arrival of the law, began to fall back. Two lay motionless in the dust. Another clutched a bleeding leg. Jake, wounded but not dead, screamed orders that grew increasingly desperate. "Burn it down! Burn the whole place!" One of the outlaws had circled behind the cabin with a torch. Clara saw him first, spinning to fire. Her shot caught him in the arm, sending the torch flying harmlessly into the dirt. But the distraction cost them. Another outlaw used the moment to rush their position. Elias met him head-on, rifle swinging like a club. The two men grappled in the dust, a brutal dance of survival. Clara tried to get a clear shot, but couldn't risk hitting Elias. Then she saw Jake, wounded but determined, raising his gun toward Elias's exposed back. Time slowed. Clara didn't think, just acted. She threw herself forward, her body shielding Elias just as Jake fired. The bullet caught her in the shoulder, spinning her around. She heard Elias roar her name, felt herself falling, saw him break his attacker's neck with his bare hands and turn on Jake with murder in his eyes. The rest was a blur of pain and shouting. The posse finally acted, perhaps shamed by a woman's courage. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions. When the smoke cleared, 3 outlaws lay dead, including Jake, whose final expression was one of complete surprise. The survivors fled into the desert, pursued half-heartedly by the sheriff's men. Clara found herself on the ground, Elias's hands pressing something against her shoulder. His face was white beneath his tan, his eyes wild with fear. "Why?" he demanded, his voice breaking. "Why did you do that?" "Couldn't let him shoot you," she managed through gritted teeth. "Damn it, Clara, damn it." He was crying, she realized with distant surprise. Elias McKenna, who faced down outlaws without flinching, was crying over her. Sheriff Briggs ambled over, chewing tobacco with studied indifference. "Well, that was quite a show. Reckon those boys won't be troubling folks anymore." "Get the doctor," Elias snarled. "Now, hold on," Briggs said. "Need to ask some questions first, like what these outlaws wanted with you folks, what you might have done to provoke." Elias was on his feet so fast Briggs stepped back, hand going to his gun. "The lady's bleeding. Get the doctor now, or I swear by God I'll go," one of the townsmen interrupted. Clara was surprised to recognize Mr. Chen, Mary's father. "My wagon's fastest." As they waited for the doctor, the posse milled around, some helping to drag the dead outlaws away, others simply gawking. Clara heard the whispers starting already, about the wild shootout, about her throwing herself in front of a bullet for Elias, about what that might mean, Mrs. Patterson was among the crowd. Clara noticed with dim amusement. The woman's face was a study in conflicting emotions, disapproval warring with something that might have been reluctant respect. Doctor. Holcomb arrived within the hour, his medical bag clutched in one hand, flask in the other. Despite his fondness for drink, his hands were steady as he examined Clara's wound. "Bullet went clean through," he announced. "Lucky inch to the right and we'd be having a different conversation. She'll heal, but it'll take time." As he worked, cleaning and bandaging, Clara bit down on a leather strap to keep from screaming. Elias held her other hand, his grip threatening to break bones. "You're a damn fool woman," the doctor said conversationally as he tied off the bandage. "Also brave as any soldier I treated in the war," Town could use more like you. After he left, the cleanup began. The dead outlaws were loaded onto a wagon, their possessions catalogued. Sheriff Briggs made a show of investigating, but it was clear he was just going through the motions. Self-defense, clear as day. He finally pronounced, "These men were known troublemakers. Won't be any charges." As the posse prepared to leave, several townspeople approached. Clara was shocked when Mrs. Chen placed a basket of food on the table, bowing slightly. "For your recovery," she said simply. Others followed. "Mr. Garrett left ammunition. The blacksmith promised to repair the damage to the cabin for free." Even some who had whispered the loudest offered awkward nods of acknowledgement. Mrs. Patterson was the last to approach. She stood stiffly, her mouth pursed as if tasting something sour. "That was a brave thing you did," she said grudgingly. "Foolish, but brave. Just protecting what's mine," Clara said quietly. The older woman's expression shifted, something almost like understanding flickering in her eyes. "Yes, I suppose you were." She turned to go, then paused. "The church ladies will be organizing a meal drive. For your recovery, I'll put your name on the list." After everyone left, Elias carried Clara inside, settling her carefully on the bed. His hands shook as he adjusted her bandages, checked her comfort a dozen times. "Stop fussing," Clara said softly. "I'm fine." "You're shot," he countered. "Because of me. Because you—" His voice broke. "Don't ever do that again." "Can't promise that." She reached up with her good arm, touching his face. "I'd do it 100 times over. You're worth protecting. Elias McKenna." He caught her hand, pressing it to his lips. "I'm not worth your life. That's not your decision to make." She pulled him down until he was lying beside her, careful of her injury. "Partnership means protecting each other. You've been protecting me since we met. Let me return the favor." They lay in silence for a while, the events of the morning settling around them like dust after a storm. Outside, Clara could hear the normal sounds of the desert returning, as if violence and death were just another part of the landscape, no more remarkable than a flash flood or sudden wind. "They were different today," Clara said eventually. "The townspeople, some of them, anyway, hard to maintain their judgments when they see what real courage looks like." Elias said, "You showed them who you really are today." "A woman who'd take a bullet for her man?" Clara managed a weak smile. "Probably confirmed their worst suspicions about my moral character. A woman who'd face down killers to protect someone she loves." Elias corrected. "That's different. That's honor. Even dried-up gossips like Mrs. Patterson understand honor. Love." He'd said it so easily, like it was an established fact rather than something they danced around. Clara's heart swelled. "Is that what we have?" she asked. "Love?" Elias shifted to look at her fully, his gray eyes serious. "What else would you call it? This feeling like my chest is too small, like I'd tear the world apart to keep you safe. Like finding you was finding the missing part of myself I didn't even know was gone." Tears slipped down Clara's cheeks. "I love you too," she whispered. "Desperately, completely. Against all reason and propriety and good sense." "Good sense is overrated," Elias said, kissing her carefully. "Give me love over sense any day." As night fell, they talked quietly about the future. The attack had changed things, shown them both how precarious happiness could be, how quickly violence could shatter peace. But it had also shown them something else, that what they had was worth fighting for, worth bleeding for, worth facing down the judgment of the world. "We could leave," Elias suggested. "Head north, start fresh somewhere they don't know our history." Clara considered it, then shook her head. "This is home. This is where Thomas is buried, where I learned to survive, where I found you. I won't be driven out by outlaws or gossips. Then we make our stand here." Elias agreed. "Together." "Together," Clara echoed, as she drifted towards sleep, aided by the laudanum the doctor had left. Clara thought about the day's events. She'd been shot, had killed a man, had faced death head-on. By all rights, she should be traumatized, terrified. Instead, she felt powerful. For the first time in her life, she'd fought for something that mattered to her. She'd stood up not just to outlaws, but to her own fears, her own ingrained belief in her worthlessness. She'd protected the man she loved and lived to tell about it. The wound in her shoulder throbbed, promising weeks of pain and limited movement. But Clara smiled in the darkness. Elias's steady breathing beside her, a better painkiller than any medicine. She'd faced the worst the desert could throw at her and survived. Whatever came next, she was ready for it. The morning sun painted the desert in shades of gold and amber as Clara stood before the assembled townspeople. 3 weeks had passed since the shootout, and her shoulder, though still tender, had healed enough for her to make this journey. Sheriff Briggs sat behind his desk, looking uncomfortable, while Mayor Hutchinson and several town council members occupied chairs arranged in a semicircle. The small courthouse was packed, with people standing along the walls and crowding the doorway. Clara had insisted on coming alone. Despite Elias's protests, this was something she needed to do herself. Mrs. Whitman, Mayor Hutchinson began formally. You've requested this hearing to address the town council. You have the floor. Clara straightened her shoulders, ignoring the twinge of pain. Thank you. Mayor, I've come to speak about dignity, about worth, about the right of every person in this town to live free from persecution based on circumstances beyond their control. A murmur ran through the crowd. Mrs. Patterson, seated in the front row, sniffed audibly. For 3 years, Clara continued, I've endured whispers, judgments, and cruel speculation about my worth as a woman and a human being. I've been called barren, worthless, ashamed my sex. And why? Because my body cannot do what some bodies can, because I chose to survive after my husband's death rather than conveniently disappear. Now, see here, Councilman Morrison started, but Clara raised her hand. I'm not finished. 3 weeks ago, outlaws came to my home. They came because one man, Elias McKenna, had the courage to protect me from them once before. And when those outlaws threatened him, threatened our home, I did what any person would do for someone they care about. I fought back. She looked around the room, meeting eyes that had once slid away from hers. Some of you were there. You saw what happened. You saw that when faced with real evil, not the manufactured scandal of a widow finding companionship, but actual violence and lawlessness. Mr. McKenna and I stood our ground. We protected each other and, by extension, this town. What's your point, Mrs. Whitman? The mayor asked, though not unkindly. My point is this. I'm done apologizing for existing. I'm done accepting judgment from people who measure worth by standards that exclude anyone different. I've built a life in this desert through my own strength and determination. I've contributed to this town through my herbs and medicines. I've shown courage when it counted. And yes, I've found love with a good man who sees my value beyond my ability or inability to bear children. The courthouse was silent now, the weight of her words settling over the assembly like dust. I'm not asking for your approval, Clara continued. I'm not asking for your friendship, though I've learned that some of you are capable of more kindness than you show. I'm simply informing you that I will no longer accept being treated as less than human. I will trade in your stores, walk your streets, and live my life openly and without shame. And if that offends you, I suggest you examine why another person's happiness threatens you so deeply. She turned to Mrs. Patterson directly. You asked once what any man could see in me. I'll tell you, he sees a survivor, a woman who didn't crumble when life took everything from her, a partner who would take a bullet for him. And if that's not worth respect, then your standards are too narrow for this wild country that demands strength from all of us. Clara took a breath, feeling lighter than she had in years. I've said my piece. Thank you for listening. The silence stretched for several heartbeats. Then, from the back of the room, came the sound of clapping. Mary Chen stood, applauding openly, her face shining with approval. Her father joined her. Then the blacksmith, then Doctor. Holcomb, one by one. Others stood and clapped. Not everyone, but enough to make Clara's eyes burn with unexpected tears. Mrs. Patterson remained seated, her face a storm of emotions. But as Clara passed her on the way out, the older woman caught her sleeve. "My sister," she said quietly, "was like you. Couldn't have children. Her husband left her for a younger woman who could give him sons. She took her own life from the shame." Mrs. Patterson's eyes were wet. "I've been angry about it for 20 years. Took it out on you. That was wrong of me." Clara squeezed the woman's hand gently. "Thank you for telling me." Outside, Elias waited with the horses, his face showing the strain of letting her face the town alone. "How did it go?" "Better than expected," Clara said, letting him help her mount. I think things might actually change." They rode home in comfortable silence, but Clara noticed Elias kept glancing at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "What?" she finally asked. "Just thinking about what a fool I was, believing I needed to be alone," he said. "Watching you in there, seeing your strength. Clara, you humble me." "We humble each other," she corrected. "That's what makes it work." Back at the cabin, they found an unexpected gift. Someone had left a young fruit tree, roots wrapped in burlap, with a note, "For new beginnings, a friend." Over the following days, the changes were small but significant. The whispers didn't stop entirely, but they were quieter, less cruel. Some townspeople nodded in greeting who had previously looked through her. The blacksmith's wife brought a pie, staying to share recipes. Dr. Holcomb stopped by to check her wound and ended up spending hours discussing medicinal plants with both Clara and Elias. "You've done something important," the doctor said as he prepared to leave. "Forced people to see past their assumptions. This town needed shaking up." Elias had thrown himself into improving their homestead with renewed energy. He expanded the cabin, adding a proper bedroom and a workspace for Clara's herbs. Together, they dug irrigation channels from the creek, planted the gifted fruit tree, and began planning a larger garden. "We could grow enough to supply the whole territory," Elias said one evening as they studied seed catalogs by lamplight. "Your medicinal plants, vegetables for preserving, make this place bloom, like you made me bloom," Clara said softly. He pulled her onto his lap, careful of her still healing shoulder. "We bloomed together. Neither of us was whole alone." It was true, Clara reflected. They had both been hiding, Elias in his mountains, her behind walls of grief and shame. Together, they'd found the courage to live fully. The test of their new acceptance came at the town's harvest festival. Clara hadn't attended in years, but this time, Elias insisted. "We're part of this community now," he said. "Time to act like it." Clara wore her best dress, one they'd ordered from the catalog, and Elias looked almost civilized in a clean shirt and freshly trimmed beard. As they entered the decorated town square, Clara felt the familiar flutter of anxiety, but then Mary Chen appeared, pulling them toward the food tables. "You must try my mother's dumplings," she insisted. The blacksmith challenged Elias to an arm wrestling contest. Dr. Holcomb's wife asked about Clara's lavender cultivation. There were still those who kept their distance, who whispered behind fans and turned away when Clara met their eyes. But they were fewer now, their influence diluted by the growing number who had chosen acceptance over judgment. The surprise of the evening came when the dancing started. The fiddle player struck up a reel, and couples began forming on the makeshift dance floor. Elias stood, offering Clara his hand with exaggerated formality. "May I have this dance, Mrs. Whitman?" "I thought you didn't dance," Clara said, even as she took his hand. "I said I didn't know how to court properly." He corrected. "Never said I couldn't dance. Mountain men have to entertain themselves somehow during the long winters." He proved as good as his word, leading her through the steps with surprising grace. Clara found herself laughing as he spun her, her skirts flaring, her heart light. Other couples made room for them, and if some expressions were disapproving, many more were smiling. "Look at that," someone said loud enough to hear. "Happiness. Been too little of that in this town." As the night wore on, Clara found herself in conversation with people who had shunned her for years. The banker's wife asked about remedies for her daughter's cough. The minister's sister mentioned her own struggles with childlessness, finding comfort in Clara's understanding. Even Mrs. Patterson, fortified by punch, managed a civil discussion about preserving techniques. "I believe you've won," Elias murmured during a break in the dancing. "Won what?" "The right to be yourself, to be happy, to live without apology." He gestured to the crowd, where she was no longer an outsider but simply another member of the community. "You faced them down with dignity and truth, showed them their prejudice was smaller than your courage." "We won," Clara corrected. "I couldn't have done any of this without you, without knowing you stood behind me." "Beside you," Elias said firmly. "Always beside you." As they rode home under a canopy of stars, Clara reflected on the journey that had brought her here, from the depths of despair, convinced of her worthlessness, to this acceptance, love, and a future bright with possibility. The cabin came into view, its windows glowing with the lamp Elias had left burning, but it was no longer just a shelter against the harsh desert. It was a home, built by two people who had found in each other the missing pieces of themselves. "What are you thinking?" Elias asked as they dismounted. Clara looked up at him, this man who had seen her value when she couldn't see it herself, who had stood as her shield against both outlaws and judgment, who loved her not despite her supposed flaws but completely as she was. "I'm thinking that sometimes the most barren ground, with the right care, can bloom the brightest," she said. He kissed her then, under the vast desert sky, and Clara knew that whatever the future brought, she would face it with her head high and her heart full. She had found her worth not in the opinions of others, but in her own strength, her own choices, and the love of a man who saw her truly. The desert wind whispered across the land, carrying with it the scent of sage and coming rain, and Clara Whitman, once called worthless, stood tall in her truth, finally and completely free. The rains came to Arizona that spring like a benediction, transforming the desert into a carpet of wildflowers. Brittlebush bloomed yellow against the red rocks, and the Palo Verde trees burst into golden glory. Clara stood in her expanded garden, marveling at the rows of medicinal herbs thriving under her care, their leaves glistening with morning dew. 6 months had passed since the harvest festival, and the changes in both the land and their lives seemed nothing short of miraculous. The cabin had grown into a proper homestead, with a workshop for Clara's herbs, a stable for their horses, and a wide porch where they spent evenings watching the sun paint the mountains purple and gold. "Never thought I'd see the desert bloom like this," Elias said, joining her among the plants. He carried a letter, his expression thoughtful. "Good news?" Clara asked, noting the official-looking envelope. "Interesting news." He handed her the letter. "From the territorial governor. Seems word of our little homestead has spread. They want to know if we'd consider supplying medicinal herbs to the army posts throughout the territory." Clara read through the formal language, her eyes widening. The contract they were offering would provide steady income, enough to expand their operation significantly. More importantly, it was recognition, official acknowledgement that what she did had value. "This is wonderful," she breathed. "But can we manage such a large order?" "We'd need help," Elias admitted. "Maybe take on some workers. I was thinking—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "There are families in town struggling, good people who just need a chance. We could offer fair wages, teach them the trade." Clara looked at her husband, for they'd been quietly married by the circuit judge 3 months prior, and felt her heart swell with pride. The lone mountain man who'd once shunned all human company now spoke of community, of helping others. "I think that's a fine idea," she said. Their first hired hand was unexpected. Mrs. Patterson's nephew, a young man named Daniel who'd lost his ranch to drought. He arrived hat in hand, clearly uncomfortable but desperate for work. "My aunt said you were fair folks," he mumbled. Said I should swallow my pride and ask for a chance. Everyone deserves a chance. Clara said simply, "Can you work hard and learn?" "Yes, ma'am." Within a month, they'd hired 2 more workers, a Mexican family who'd been scratching out a living on the margins of town. The father, Miguel, had a natural understanding of plants, while his wife, Rosa, brought organizational skills that transformed their preserving process. The homestead hummed with activity. What had once been Clara's lonely refuge became a place of purpose and productivity. The irony wasn't lost on her. The Barren woman now nurturing not just plants, but people, creating abundance where there had been only survival. One evening, as the workers headed home and the desert settled into its evening quiet, Clara found Elias on the porch, sketching something on a piece of paper. "What's that?" she asked, settling beside him. "Just an idea." He showed her the drawing plans for a small schoolhouse. "Figured if we're building a community here, might need a place for learning. You always said you wanted to teach." Clara stared at the sketch, tears pricking her eyes. "But I can't." "Can't what? You teach Rosa about herbs every day. You've got Daniel reading better just by leaving books around. Teaching isn't just about having children of your own. It's about sharing knowledge, nurturing growth." He set the sketch aside and took her hands. "You are a teacher, Clara. Always have been." The schoolhouse was built that fall. A simple adobe structure with real glass windows and a bell salvaged from an abandoned mission. The territorial government, impressed by their herb operation, provided books and supplies. On the first day of school, 12 children arrived. Workers' kids, townspeople who'd decided Clara Whitman might have something worth learning after all. She stood before them, nervous as a new bride, but when she began talking about the desert plants and their uses, the words flowed like water. The children listened with bright eyes, eager to learn about the world around them. By the end of the week, they were bringing her specimens, asking questions. Hungry for knowledge, she was overjoyed to share. Dr. Holcomb visited one afternoon, finding Clara surrounded by children learning to properly dry and store medicinal herbs. "Look at this," he said to Elias, who was repairing the schoolhouse steps. A woman they called worthless, teaching the next generation skills that'll serve them their whole lives. Makes an old man believe in justice. Justice has nothing to do with it. Elias replied, watching his wife with soft eyes. "That's just Clara being Clara. I merely gave her room to grow. And she gave you reason to rejoin the world," the doctor observed. "Funny how that works." The pinnacle of their transformation came the following spring. When the rains returned even stronger than before, the desert exploded with life. Cacti bloomed in impossible colors, and the usually dry creek ran full and singing. It was then that Clara noticed the change in herself, a familiar queasiness in the mornings that she'd experienced once before. Years ago with Thomas, Dr. Holcomb confirmed what she barely dared hope at 31. After years of believing herself barren, Clara was expecting a child. The news spread through the community like wildfire. Some called it a miracle. Others said it was simply nature's timing. Clara didn't care what they called it. She only knew that sometimes the desert bloomed after years of drought, and sometimes a woman's body decided its own schedule for miracles. Elias's reaction was everything she could have hoped. He held her with trembling hands, his eyes wet, whispering promises and prayers in equal measure. "Whether this child comes to term or not," he said fiercely, "you are complete and perfect. This changes nothing about your worth." But the child did come to term, born during a spectacular thunderstorm that turned the desert electric with lightning. Sarah McKenna arrived squalling and perfect, with her mother's auburn hair and her father's gray eyes. The midwife who'd once declared Clara barren wept as she placed the baby in her arms. As Clara recovered, visitors came in a steady stream. The school children brought drawings, the workers brought food, and even the coldest townspeople brought gifts and congratulations. Mrs. Patterson, now a regular visitor, sat beside the bed with suspiciously bright eyes. "I was wrong about so many things," she said quietly. "You've taught this whole town a lesson about judgment and worth. about second chances and unexpected blessings. Clara, exhausted but euphoric, managed to smile. We all teach each other, if we're willing to learn. Now, as the sun set on another desert day, Clara stood with Elias on their porch, Sarah sleeping peacefully in her arms. The homestead spread before them, gardens thriving, workshop busy, schoolhouse waiting for tomorrow's lessons. Workers' children played in the yard while their parents finished the day's tasks. The desert that had once seemed so barren, so hostile, now bloomed with life and possibility. "Remember when you said I was the only treasure you needed?" Clara asked softly. Elias wrapped his arms around both his girls, his voice rough with emotion. "Still true. This," he gestured to their daughter, their home, their community. "This is all extra blessing. You were always enough." Clara leaned into his strength, watching the stars emerge in the vast sky. She thought of the journey that had brought them here, the loneliness, the judgment, the struggle to find worth in a world that measured it so narrowly. She thought of a scared widow convinced she was worthless, and a mountain man certain he needed no one. How wrong they'd both been, and how perfectly right they'd been for each other. "We made the desert bloom," she murmured. "No," Elias corrected gently. "We learned it was always ready to bloom, just needed the right conditions, like us." As if in agreement, a coyote called in the distance, not mournful now, but wild and free and alive. The desert sang its evening song, and Clara Whitman McKenna, once called barren and worthless, stood at the center of an abundant life, proof that worth cannot be measured by others' standards, and that love, like rain in the desert, comes in its own time and transforms everything it touches. The stars wheeled overhead, the baby stirred in her sleep, and life in all its messy, miraculous, unexpected glory continued on, as it always had, as it always would, in the wild heart of the Arizona desert. Thank you for listening to this story of love and redemption in the Wild West. Where are you listening from? We'd love to hear your thoughts and connect with listeners around the world. Please subscribe to our channel From Wild West and share your reflections on Clara and Elias's journey. Your comments and stories inspire us to keep bringing these tales of the American frontier to life.